500 worlds, 500 burning pyres in the void. And at the center of it all, one question that would decide the fate of an entire sector. Can flesh and faith triumph over the certainty of death itself? The galaxy doesn't forgive hesitation. It doesn't reward mercy. And when the Necrons awaken, it doesn't even remember what those words mean. This is the story of how Fire Lord Cato Sicarius discovered that some wars aren't fought to be won. They're fought to prove that courage still matters when the universe has already decided you should die. Imagine standing on the bridge of a battle barge, watching an entire star system go dark. Not from shadows or nebulae, but from something worse. From silence. From the systematic extinguishing of life itself, world by world, like candles snuffed out by an invisible hand. That's what the Imperium witnessed in the Vidar sector during the dying years of the 41st millennium. A creeping, inexorable darkness that moved with mechanical precision, consuming everything in its path. The first worlds fell without warning. Mining colonies, agricultural planets, forge worlds that had hammered out weapons for the Emperor's armies for 10,000 years. One moment they were transmitting their daily reports, their tithes, their prayers. The next, nothing, just static. Just the horrible quiet of dead Vox channels that would never speak again. When the Adeptus Mechanicus sent explorer fleets to investigate, they found something that defied every law of the Omnissiah. Cities flayed down to bare rock. Oceans drained to dust. Atmospheres stripped away with surgical precision. And in orbit around each dead world, geometric patterns of energy that pulsed with a light that seemed to devour hope itself. The tech priests tried to analyze it, tried to understand it with their cold logic and blessed algorithms. But logic has no power over gods who died and refused to stay dead. The Necrons had awakened, not a raiding party, not a tomb world stirring from slumber. An empire, the Saudic dynasty, ancient beyond human comprehension, had opened its eyes and remembered its purpose, to reclaim a galaxy that had been stolen from them by younger, weaker races, races made of flesh, races that still believed in things like hope and tomorrow. Lord Commander Titus received the distress call in the fortress monastery of Taliser. By then, 70 worlds had already fallen, 70 lights extinguished from the Emperor's realm. He stood in the Strategium, a giant among giants, his armor bearing the scars of 100 campaigns, and he studied the hololithic display with eyes that had seen too much death to be surprised by more. The red marks spreading across the sector map looked like a disease, like corruption. But this wasn't chaos, this was something older, something colder. Something that killed without hate, without passion, with nothing but the terrible certainty of an equation being solved. His fellow Space Marines watched him in silence. The Ultramarines, sons of Gilliman, masters of strategy and doctrine. They knew what he was thinking because they were thinking it too. The Codex Astartes, that holy text of warfare written by their own Primarch, had protocols for every kind of enemy. But how do you fight an enemy that doesn't bleed, that doesn't feel pain, that rises again and again, teleporting away only to return with perfect memory of how you killed them before? Titus spoke, and his voice carried the weight of command that had been earned through blood and fire. "We go to war," he said. And in those 4 words was everything the Imperium had ever been. Defiance, fury, the absolute refusal to surrender, even when surrender was the only logical choice. The Crusade fleet assembled at the muster point of Kar Duniash. Over 300 ships. Dozens of Space Marine chapters. Guard regiments from 50 different worlds, each bringing their own culture of warfare, their own way of dying for the Emperor. The firepower assembled there could have cracked continents, could have boiled oceans, could have stood against any conventional threat the galaxy might produce. But the Necrons weren't conventional. They were inevitable. The first engagement came at the world of Thanatos Prime, a fortress world that should have been impregnable. Its void shields could withstand orbital bombardment for years. Its defense lasers could carve through capital ships like knives through paper. 30 billion souls lived under its protective domes, believing themselves safe. believing that humanity's military might could hold back the dark. They were wrong. The Necron fleet didn't announce itself with threats or demands. It simply appeared, translating from dimensions that human science couldn't even name. Their ships looked like tombs, like monuments, like things that should be buried but had clawed their way back to the surface. And when they opened fire, reality itself seemed to protest. Gauss weapons that unmade matter at the molecular level. Particle whips that could cut a cruiser in half with a single beam. But worst of all was the silence. No battle cries, no workeries. Just the cold, efficient execution of a predetermined outcome. Titus led the Void Assault personally, commanding from the deck of the Victus Imperator. He watched his ships dive into that mechanical storm like angels descending into hell. He saw them die. Watched as ancient vessels, each with centuries of glorious history, were systematically dissected by weapons that didn't care about glory or history. The Vox channels filled with screaming, with prayers, with the sounds of men and women realizing that their sacrifice might not matter, that the universe might not care how bravely they died. But here's the thing about Space Marines that the Necrons, for all their ancient intelligence, could never understand. They don't fight because they think they'll win. They fight because the fight itself is sacred. Because in a galaxy designed to crush hope, every act of resistance is a prayer. Every moment of defiance is proof that the human spirit can't be calculated away by cold equations of probability. The Victus Imperator crashed through the Necron line like a fist through glass. Its Nova cannon spoke with the voice of dying stars, each shot carrying enough force to shatter moons. Around it, strike cruisers and escorts wove a dance of destruction, their weapons creating storms of light against the void. They paid for every kilometer in blood and burning promethium. They paid in ships that would never return home. But they paid it gladly, because that's what warriors do when extinction reaches out its hand. Titus made planetfall with his command squad 30 hours into the battle. They dropped through fire and death, their pods screaming through an atmosphere thick with ash from dying cities. When they hit the ground, the world around them was ... wrong. That's the only word that captures it. The physics were wrong. The light bent at angles that shouldn't exist. Shadows fell upward. Gravity pulled sideways in stuttering pulses that made even transhuman physiology rebel. This wasn't just a battlefield. This was a place where the Necrons had begun rewriting the fundamental rules of reality itself, reshaping it to match the cold logic of their necrodermis bodies. The cities of Thanatos Prime had been magnificent once, spires reaching toward the heavens like prayers made of steel and stone. Now they were monuments to systematic annihilation. Every building stripped to its skeleton, every street measured and dissected. The Necrons didn't destroy with rage. They deconstructed with curiosity, as if studying how lesser beings dared to build in a galaxy that belonged to them. Bodies lay in perfect geometric patterns, arranged by the killing machines with an artist's precision. Not cruelty, worse, indifference. Titus led his warriors through streets that hummed with hostile energy. Every step felt like walking through a tomb, and in a sense, that's exactly what they were doing. The air tasted of ozone and something else. Something that made his enhanced senses recoil. It was the taste of deep time. Of eons. Of civilizations that had risen and fallen before humanity's ancestors had learned to make fire. His armor's sensors screamed warnings about chronometric distortions, about localized time fields that could age a man to dust in seconds or freeze him in a moment that would last forever. They found the first survivors in an underground bunker complex. 300 souls, mostly civilians, huddled in the dark with lasguns they barely knew how to use. When Titus descended the access shaft, they looked at him the way drowning men look at a rope, with desperate, aching hope. One woman, her face streaked with tears and ash, grabbed his armored gauntlet with hands that trembled. "Are we saved?" she whispered. "Please, tell me the Emperor sent you to save us." He wanted to lie to her. wanted to promise salvation and victory and all the comfortable certainties that humans need to keep fighting. But Titus had learned long ago that false hope is crueler than honest despair. "I can give you a chance," he said, his voice gentle despite the war raging above. "I can give you a weapon, a choice, to fight or to hide. But saved?" He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood their weight. "That depends on how much of ourselves we're willing to sacrifice." The woman nodded. She understood. In that moment, looking into the eyes of an angel of death who refused to promise miracles, she understood more about the Imperium than a lifetime of Imperial propaganda could have taught her. Survival wasn't a right. It was something you carved out of the universe's indifference with blood and will and absolute unyielding defiance. The Necron attack came 3 hours later, and it came with a precision that made conventional military tactics look like children playing at war. Warriors phased through solid walls, their Gauss flares humming with the promise of molecular dissolution. Scarabs, billions of them, flowed through the corridors like a living metal tide, dismantling everything they touched. And above it all, the destroyers glided on anti-gravity fields, their weapons systems calculating kill trajectories with mathematical perfection. Titus met them in the central junction, where 5 corridors converged into a killing ground. His power sword ignited with a scream of disrupted atoms, wreathed in energy fields that could cut through tank armor. Around him, his brothers formed a wall of ceramite and fury. Brother Gaius with his heavy bolter, each shell a small explosion. Brother Theron with his plasma gun, holding bottled stars in his hands. Brother Castor and his chainsword, its teeth hungry for metal that thought itself immortal. The first Necron warrior that approached moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of something that had forgotten what organic motion looked like. Its eyes glowed with foxfire green, and when it raised its Gauss flare, time seemed to slow. Titus could see the energy building in its weapon, could calculate the angle of fire, could predict with absolute certainty that someone he loved was about to die. But prediction isn't the same as acceptance. He moved faster than thought, his superhuman reflexes pushing him beyond human limits. His sword carved through the Necron's torso in a single stroke, and for a heartbeat, he felt triumph. Then the machine's self-repair protocols activated. Living metal flowed like mercury, knitting the wound closed, pulling scattered atoms back together through technology that mocked entropy itself. The Necron's head rotated 180 degrees, its expression unchanging, and it opened fire. Brother Theron took the hit. The Gauss beam struck his right pauldron and simply erased it, atom by atom, drilling through ceramite and plasteel and finally flesh. He screamed, not from pain, though pain there certainly was, but from the horror of watching his own body unmade. Watching molecules that had been him scatter into the uncaring void. Titus was beside him in an instant, dragging him back as the firefight exploded into full fury. The battle lasted 14 minutes. 14 minutes of hell compressed into a space where every second could be your last. The Space Marines fought with all the skill and rage their training had instilled. But for every Necron they destroyed, another phased in to replace it. The mechanical soldiers didn't care about losses, didn't mourn their fallen, didn't even register them as losses, because nothing that could be rebuilt was ever truly destroyed. They were teaching the Imperium a lesson in mathematical certainty. Flesh fails, metal endures. But then something changed. Something the Necrons, for all their calculating intelligence, hadn't accounted for. The civilians, those 300 souls who had every reason to hide, to let the angels of death handle the fighting, to preserve their fragile lives for another day. They didn't, they couldn't, because they'd looked into Titus's eyes and understood that survival meant participation. That being human in a universe designed to erase humanity meant fighting even when logic said you'd lose. They poured into the corridor behind the Space Marines, las guns barking their defiant red light. Their shots barely scratched the necrodermis plating, but that wasn't the point. The point was that they were there, that they refused to die quietly. An old man, easily 70 years old, stood beside Brother Gaius and fired his lasgun until the power pack ran dry, then drew a knife and rushed a Necron warrior with a war cry that belonged to a younger man. He died, of course. The Gauss flare caught him full in the chest. But in dying, he bought Gaius that calf-second needed to plant a crack grenade in the warrior's spinal housing. One death for one kill. By any military standard, a terrible trade. But by the standards of the human heart, a victory that mathematics could never calculate. The Necrons withdrew. Not in retreat, but in that same calculated manner they did everything. The engagement had yielded data. The casualties were within acceptable parameters. They would return when the probability matrices indicated optimal success. They didn't understand that some things can't be quantified. That rage and grief and love create variables that refuse to be solved. Titus carried Brother Theron to the makeshift apothecarian himself. The wound had been cauterized by the Gauss beam's energy, which had probably saved his life, but he'd lost his right arm from the shoulder down. The apothecary worked in grim silence, already calculating what bionics would be needed, what ceremonies of replacement would honor the sacrifice. But Theron was smiling, actually smiling. "Did you see them?" he whispered, his voice weak from blood loss and shock. "The civilians. They stood with us, brother. They stood with us." That night, Titus stood on what remained of a tower overlooking the city, watching the Necron ships carve patterns of green lightning across the sky. Strategic bombardment. Calculated destruction. Every shot placed to maximize infrastructure damage while minimizing energy expenditure. Efficient, logical, perfect in its cold execution. And absolutely, utterly soulless. His cum bead crackled. "Captain Ventress, commanding the Void assets. My lord, the situation in orbit is untenable. We've lost 40% of our capital ships. The Necron vessels are adapting to our tactics faster than we can adjust. I'm recommending a staged withdrawal to the Mandeville point." Withdrawal. The word tasted like ash. It meant abandoning Thanatos Prime to total annihilation. It meant accepting that 30 billion souls would be added to the tally of the lost. It meant admitting that sometimes courage isn't enough. But it also meant preserving his forces to fight another day, to save other worlds, to continue the war across those remaining 500 worlds that hadn't yet fallen. Titus closed his eyes, and in that moment of darkness, he saw them all. Every face. Every soldier who'd died trusting his commands. Every civilian who'd stood in corridors with lasguns, choosing death with dignity over life and submission. Every sacrifice made in the Emperor's name. And he understood, with a clarity that cut deeper than any blade, that this war couldn't be won by conventional means. The Necrons were too numerous, too advanced, too perfectly designed for systematic conquest. Fighting them world by world was just delaying the inevitable, trading lives for time in an equation that would always balance toward extinction. But what if there was another way? What if... His eyes opened. In the distance, at the city's heart, something pulsed. A structure the Necrons had erected. A monolith of living metal that thrummed with power that made his teeth ache even from kilometers away. A control node. A connection point to their greater network. And suddenly, standing there on that ruined tower with the screams of the dying echoing through the Vox, Lord Commander Titus had an idea that was either brilliance or madness. Perhaps both. He activated the command channel, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. "Ventress, belay that withdrawal order. I need every available strike force, every asset that can still fight, concentrated on my position. And get me a direct line to the Adeptus Mechanicus. I need a tech priest who's expendable, brilliant, and completely insane." There was a pause, then Ventress's careful response. "My lord, what are you planning?" Titus stared at that pulsing monolith, at the heart of alien technology that had conquered the galaxy before humanity existed, and he smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Something the Codex Astartes never anticipated," he said. "Something that requires us to become the thing we're fighting. We're going to stop ... Destroying their network and start corrupting it. The words hung in the air like a heresy. No, not like a heresy. They were a heresy. The Adeptus Mechanicus had strict protocols about Xenos technology, particularly Necron technology. Observe, record, destroy. Never interface. Never integrate. The machines of the Necrons carried a taint older than religions, a corruption not of chaos, but of something worse. The absolute certainty that organic life was an aberration to be corrected. To touch their technology was to risk contamination, not just of the body, but of the soul itself. If souls could be said to exist in beings that had murdered their own gods and downloaded their consciousness into metal tombs. But Titus had seen enough death to understand that purity was a luxury the Imperium could no longer afford, not here. Not against an enemy that measured victory in geological timescales and treated the loss of entire armies as mere data points in an optimization algorithm. If they wanted to survive, they needed to fight fire with something hotter than fire. They needed to fight mathematical precision with human unpredictability. They needed to inject chaos into a system designed to eliminate every variable that couldn't be controlled. The Tet priest who answered his call was named Archmagos Deltrian Vex, and he arrived on Thanatos Prime with the kind of barely controlled enthusiasm that immediately marked him as exactly the kind of dangerous genius Titus had requested. His robes were stained with sacred oils and what appeared to be scorch marks from failed experiments. 17 mechanical appendages writhed from his back like the arms of a metallic spider, each one holding a different tool, sensor, or weapon. His remaining organic eye glowed with a fervor that most people reserved for religious revelation, while his augmetic eye clicked and whirred as it cycled through visual spectrums that human vision had never evolved to perceive. "Lord Commander," he said, his voice a discordant blend of organic vocal cords and Vox synthesizer, "I understand you wish to commit techno-heresy of the highest order." How absolutely magnificent. They stood before the Necron monolith in the dead heart of the city, surrounded by a perimeter of space marines who looked distinctly uncomfortable with what they were about to witness. The structure rose 30 meters into the ash-choked sky, its surface inscribed with glyphs that hurt to look at directly. Not because they were horrific, but because they operated on geometric principles that the human brain simply couldn't process. Angles that somehow existed in more dimensions than the three humanity was designed to perceive. Looking at them too long induced vertigo, nausea, and the creeping sensation that reality itself was just a consensus hallucination that these ancient machines had never agreed to. Energy pulsed through the monolith in rhythmic waves, each pulse synchronized with similar structures across the planet. Deltrian sensors painted the air with data streams, hololithic projections that showed the network extending far beyond Thanatos Prime, through the webway of their own making, through dimension-spanning conduits that made warp travel look primitive by comparison. The Necrons had linked their entire empire into a single vast machine consciousness. Every tomb world, every warrior, every scarab, all connected in a network of such complexity that it made the Imperium's own communication systems look like children's toys. "Beautiful," Deltrian whispered, his mechadendrites reaching toward the monolith like a supplicant toward a shrine. "Do you see it, Lord Commander? This is not mere technology. This is mathematics made manifest, physics bent to will. They've created a system where distance and time are negotiable concepts, where causality itself can be rewritten through sheer computational power, and you want to poison it, to introduce entropy into perfection." He turned, and his organic eye gleamed with something that might have been madness or might have been the deepest wisdom. "You magnificent fool. Do you understand what will happen if we succeed? What will happen if we fail?" Titus met his gaze without flinching. "I understand that 300 worlds are already ash. That 200 more are fighting battles they cannot win. That in 6 months, maybe less, the Necrons will have systematically dismantled an entire sector of the Imperium. And there's nothing in the Codex Astartes that can stop them. So yes, Archmagos, I understand that we need to do something unprecedented, something dangerous, something that might damn us all. But the alternative is certain extinction, and I'd rather die trying the impossible than live knowing I accepted the inevitable." Deltrian laughed, a sound like grinding gears in electric discharge. "Then let us begin the greatest experiment in techno-archaeology the Mechanicus has never sanctioned." His mechadendrites plunged into interface ports on the monolith's surface, and immediately his body went rigid, locked in communion with an intelligence so alien that contact with it bordered on psychic assault. What happened next defied every protocol, every safeguard, every lesson learned from 10,000 years of fighting Xenos threats. Deltrian didn't just access the Necron network. He conversed with it. His own augmetics, designed to interface with Imperial technology blessed by the Omnissiah, somehow found common ground with systems designed by a civilization that had achieved technological apotheosis before Terra's sun had finished forming. It shouldn't have been possible. The incompatibility should have fried his neural pathways in microseconds. But Deltrian had spent 3 centuries studying the fragments of Necron code retrieved from battlefields across the galaxy, learning the mathematical language that underpinned their existence. He'd gone mad doing it, his colleague said. Lost himself in equations that had no solutions in conventional mathematics. But madness and genius had always been siblings, and in this moment, his madness was exactly what the Imperium needed. "I'm in," he gasped, his voice distorted by harmonics that shouldn't exist in human speech. "Emperor's teeth, I'm inside their network. It's beautiful and terrible. There's no consciousness here, not as we understand it. Just protocols. Endless, perfect protocols cascading through quantum processors that make our cogitators look like counting beads. They're not thinking, they're executing. Following programs written when your ancestors were still aquatic creatures learning to breathe air." Titus watched the tech priest's body spasm as foreign code warred with his own augmetics. "Can you corrupt it? Can you introduce an error?" "Error?" Deltrian's laugh had taken on a quality that suggested he was no longer entirely sane, if he'd ever been. "There's no such thing as error in their system. Every calculation is checked and rechecked across 1 billion nodes. Every action is verified against predicted outcomes. They've eliminated error the way a surgeon eliminates cancer. But ... double quotes. His organic eye focused on something only he could see, some pattern in the data flow that others would miss. But error and chaos are not the same thing. Error is a mistake. Chaos is a choice. And choice, Lord Commander, is something their entire civilization was designed to eliminate." He began to input code, his mechadendrites dancing across the monolith's surface in a blur of motion too fast for unaugmented eyes to follow. He wasn't hacking in any conventional sense. He was negotiating, trading information, offering solutions to problems the Necron system hadn't known it had, embedding himself deeper into their network by being useful. It was the approach of a virus, not a battering ram, quiet, insidious, patient. Hours passed. The perimeter guards reported increasing Necron activity, warriors and immortals converging on their position as the system detected the intrusion. But detecting wasn't the same as understanding. The Necrons had spent millions of years in stasis, and in that time, they'd missed the evolution of organic warfare. They couldn't comprehend that sometimes the greatest threat wasn't an army at your gates, but a single individual whispering poison into your own thoughts. Titus stood vigil beside Deltrian, his bolt pistol ready, knowing that at any moment this could all collapse into a final, desperate last stand. Around him, his brothers prepared for the inevitable assault. Brother Gaius checked and rechecked his heavy bolter's ammunition feed. Brother Castor murmured prayers to the Emperor, his chainsword idling with a hungry growl. They were ready to die, had always been ready, but they'd prefer to die knowing their death mattered, that it bought something more valuable than time. Then Deltrian screamed, not in pain, but in triumph that bordered on religious ecstasy. "I found it, the Prime Directive. The core protocol that governs every action, every decision, every thought these machines have. It's beautiful in its simplicity. It's monstrous in its implications. They exist to restore their civilization to dominance, to reclaim the galaxy from the younger races, to correct the aberration of organic life. His head snapped toward Titus, and both eyes glowed with unholy light. But what if organic life isn't an aberration? What if it's an optimization? What if evolution is a form of technology more advanced than anything they've created? Titus understood immediately. You're going to make them question their own purpose. Better, Delphrian hissed. I'm going to give them a problem they can't solve. A paradox embedded so deep in their network that every attempt to purge it will only spread it further. Watch. He input the final sequence, and across Thanatos Prime, every Necron monolith suddenly flickered. Just for a moment. Just for a single frozen instant where their perfect synchronization stuttered. It wasn't much. To the untrained eye, it might have been nothing at all. But Titus had spent enough time studying the enemy to recognize what he was seeing. Doubt, uncertainty, the first crack in a perfect machine. The Necrons didn't retreat, didn't pause their assault. But something had changed. Their movements, always precise, showed infinitesimal hesitations. Calculations that should have been instantaneous now took microseconds longer. It wasn't enough to stop them, but it was enough to slow them. And in warfare, the difference between instant death and death delayed by a fraction of a second was often the difference between extinction and survival. Deltrian collapsed, his organic components shutting down from the strain of the interface. His last words before unconsciousness took him were whispered with the reverence of a man who'd glimpsed something beyond mortal understanding. I asked them why they hate organic life so much. And somewhere in their network, in quantum processors that span a galaxy, something tried to answer. Tried and failed. Because they don't hate us, Lord Commander. They don't feel anything at all. And that's the poison I've given them. The question of whether existence without feeling is existence at all. Titus ordered the immediate evacuation of Thanatos Prime. They'd done what they came to do, planted a seed of chaos in a garden of perfect order. Now they needed to survive long enough to see if it would grow. The extraction was brutal, fighting their way through streets suddenly filled with Necrons, whose tactical responses seemed confused, not broken, but uncertain, making choices that didn't quite match their previous efficiency. Aboard the Victus Imperator, as Thanatos Prime shrank in the viewport, Titus studied the sector map with new eyes. 500 worlds. The Necrons had already claimed 312. But now, perhaps, they had a weapon that didn't rely on superior firepower or tactical genius. They had doubt. The most human of weapons, turned against an enemy that had thought themselves beyond such weaknesses. Captain Ventress approached, his expression troubled. My lord, we're receiving strange reports from the other battlefronts. Necron forces are exhibiting anomalies, minor tactical errors, delayed responses. Nothing catastrophic, but consistent across multiple engagements. What did Deltrian do down there? Titus didn't answer immediately. He watched the stars, those distant points of light that represented worlds still fighting, still dying, still hoping that the Emperor's angels would arrive in time to save them. And he wondered if what they'd done was salvation or damnation. If introducing chaos into a perfect system was an act of genius or the greatest mistake the Imperium would ever make. Because the thing about asking a question that can't be answered is that someone, or something, will keep trying to answer it. And when that something controls an empire spanning thousands of worlds, when it has access to weapons that can unmake stars and technology that treats physics as a polite suggestion, obsession with an impossible question could lead to. The thought died unfinished, because at that moment, every sensor on the bridge screamed an alarm. Every auger, every auspex, every system designed to detect threats suddenly painted the viewport with hostile signatures that shouldn't exist. Couldn't exist. The Necron fleet hadn't scattered to defend their conquered worlds. They'd done the opposite. They'd converged. Drawn together by some unified command, some central intelligence that had analyzed Deltrian's paradox and reached a conclusion that defied All strategic logic. Every Necron vessel within 3 systems, hundreds of ships ranging from raider-class escorts to continent-sized battleships, had translated into the same coordinates. They hung in the void like a necropolis given motion, their formations creating geometric patterns so vast they could be seen from light years away. And at the center of it all, emerging from a dimensional rift that tore reality like tissue paper, came something that made every previous engagement seem like a skirmish between children. A world engine, not a ship, not a weapon. A planet converted into an instrument of such apocalyptic destructive potential that entire civilizations had been erased by its passage. Its surface bristled with weapons batteries that could crack continental plates. Its core housed reactors that harvested energy from spatial dimensions humanity didn't have names for. And it was moving toward them with the slow, inexorable patience of a guillotine falling. Titus felt his twin hearts hammering against his fused ribcage, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades. Fear, real, primal fear that cut through transhuman conditioning and centuries of battlefield experience. He'd fought demons, stood against the tide of chaos itself, but this was different. This was the cold acknowledgement that he was staring at something that could end everything they'd built, everything they'd fought for, with the casual ease of a man crushing an insect. "Emperor, preserve us," Ventress whispered beside him, and hearing fear in the captain's voice was somehow worse than seeing the world engine itself. Ventress, who'd never flinched, never wavered, who'd stood against impossible odds with the calm certainty of righteous faith, was afraid. The Vox erupted with panicked chatter. Fleet commanders demanding orders. Astropaths screaming warnings across the warp. Tech priests babbling calculations that all reached the same conclusion. They couldn't win this. Couldn't even meaningfully delay it. The combined firepower of their entire crusade fleet wouldn't scratch the world engine's shields. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution, and they were just waiting for the executioner to notice them. Titus opened a fleet-wide channel, his voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of absolute command. "All vessels, maintain formation. Do not break, do not scatter. If we die here, we die together, but we do not die running." He paused, feeling the weight of every soul under his command, every life that trusted him to lead them to something other than meaningless slaughter. "Engage at maximum range. Target the world engine's sensor arrays. We're not trying to destroy it. We're trying to blind it." It was insane. Futile. A gesture of defiance that wouldn't change the outcome by even a fraction of a percentage point. But it was human. And sometimes, in a universe governed by cold mathematics and cruel certainty, the most revolutionary act was refusing to act rationally. The Imperial fleet opened fire, and for a moment, a glorious, terrible moment, the void lit up like a newborn star. Lance batteries that could boil oceans. Nova cannons that threw projectiles at relativistic speeds. Torpedoes carrying warheads that could atomize cities. All of it converging on the world engine in a display of firepower that would have annihilated any conventional target. The explosions were beautiful. Mushroom clouds of plasma expanding in the vacuum, each one bright enough to be seen from neighboring systems. For 3 heartbeats, maybe 4, it looked like hope might have teeth. Then the light faded, and the world engine remained, untouched, untroubled. Its shields hadn't even flickered. The entire assault, the combined might of humanity's finest weapons, had achieved exactly nothing. It was a lesson in scale. A reminder that some threats transcended conventional resistance. That courage and faith in all the things the Imperium held sacred meant nothing to a being that measured its age in epochs and viewed entire civilizations as temporary inconveniences. The world engine's weapons came online and reality screamed, not metaphorically. The very fabric of spacetime protested as those ancient guns charged, drawing power from dimensions that existed outside conventional physics. Titus watched the energy readings spike beyond any scale his sensors could measure, watched his tech priests go pale beneath their awed medics as they realized what was about to happen. But the killing blow never fell. Instead, the world engine hesitated. Its weapons charged, held at maximum capacity, but didn't fire. The Necron fleet around it suddenly broke formation, ships wheeling in patterns that made no tactical sense, as if receiving contradictory orders from multiple sources. And then, through the Vox static and spatial interference, Titus heard something that shouldn't be possible. A voice, digital, fragmented, speaking Gothic with an accent that belonged to a language dead for 60 million years. Why do you resist when resistance is illogical? Why do you fight when fighting only delays the inevitable? Why do you hope when hope is a computational error? The voice wasn't asking. It was genuinely questioning, as if the concept itself was a puzzle that needed solving. We have analyzed your actions, studied your responses, calculated every possible outcome. You cannot win. Your species lacks the technology, the time, the resources. Yet you persist. Why? Deltrian's virus. It had spread further than they'd dared imagine, not just corrupting local networks, but propagating through the Necrons' quantum communication systems, reaching into the heart of their collective consciousness. And somewhere in that vast distributed intelligence, something was trying to understand what it meant to be organic. To feel fear and choose to fight anyway. To know death was certain and still hope for tomorrow. Titus didn't know if the world engine expected an answer. Didn't know if it was capable of understanding one. But he spoke anyway, his words transmitted across every channel, meant not just for his own fleet, but for whatever alien intelligence was listening. We fight because the fight itself matters. Because choosing to stand against extinction, even knowing we'll lose, is what makes us human. You've spent millions of years trying to eliminate variables, to make existence predictable and perfect. But you've forgotten something. Life isn't about certainty. It's about the choices we make when nothing is certain. Silence. For 10 seconds that felt like hours, nothing moved. The world engine hung there, its weapons still charged, while its vast processing power struggled with a concept it had been designed to never encounter. Purpose without predictable outcome. Meaning without measurable result. The value of an action divorced from its consequences. Then something extraordinary happened. The Necron fleet began to fracture, not physically, but ideologically. Ships started receiving different priorities, different objectives, as various nodes in their network reached different conclusions about Deltrian's paradox. Some moved to continue the assault, following their core programming of galactic reconquest. Others halted, frozen by recursive logic loops as they tried to solve an unsolvable problem. And a few, a terrifying few, began targeting other Necron vessels, having reached the conclusion that the only way to eliminate the paradox was to eliminate the Necrons carrying it. Civil war. Instantaneous, galaxy-spanning civil war erupting within a unified consciousness that had never known internal conflict. It was chaos given form, entropy injected into a system designed to be entropy-proof, and it was spreading. Through every tomb world, every buried fleet, every sleeping construct, the question propagated like a disease. What is the purpose of existence if existence has no meaning beyond its own continuation? Ventress grabbed Titus's arm, his grip tight enough to dent ceramite. My lord, we need to withdraw, now, while they're distracted. We can escape to the Mandeville point, warn the other sectors, coordinate a proper response. He was right. Tactically, strategically, by every measure of military doctrine, immediate withdrawal was the only logical choice. They'd achieved something impossible, turned the Necrons' own perfect unity against them. Now they needed to preserve that victory, to ensure someone survived to tell the Imperium what had happened here. But Titus was staring at the world engine, at that monstrous amalgamation of technology and ancient fury, and he was thinking about those 300 civilians on Thanatos Prime, who'd stood in a corridor with lasguns, knowing they'd die but choosing to fight anyway. He was thinking about Brother Theron, smiling through blood loss and pain because people had stood with him. He was thinking about every soldier who'd ever made the illogical, beautiful, utterly human choice to sacrifice everything for a cause that might not even remember their names. "No," he said softly. Then louder, with the certainty of a man who'd finally understood what the Imperium truly needed from him. "No, we're not withdrawing. We're attacking." The bridge fell silent. Every officer, every servitor, every piece of equipment seemed to stop and process those words. Attack, not defend, not retreat. Attack a target that could erase their entire fleet with a single volley. It was madness. It was suicide. It was exactly the kind of illogical, faith-driven insanity that had kept humanity alive for 10,000 years in a galaxy designed to kill them. Titus turned to face his command crew, and they saw something in his eyes that transcended rank or authority. They saw a man who'd looked into the abyss of certain death and decided that how you died mattered more than whether you died at all. The world engine is the central processing node for this entire sector. It's not just a weapon. It's their command and control, their strategic coordinator. And right now, while their network is fragmenting, while they're too busy fighting themselves to maintain proper defensive protocols, it's vulnerable. Not much, not for long. But enough. He pulled up a hololithic display of the world engine, his fingers dancing across control interfaces as he highlighted a specific region on the planet ship's surface. A scar in the metal landscape, barely visible against the vast expanse of ancient armor plating. This, a thermal vent. Probably inactive, probably shielded by systems that would vaporize our fleet if they were operating at full capacity. But the world engine is trying to process Deltrian's paradox. Its attention, for the first time in millions of years, is divided. If we can get a strike team inside, plant sufficient explosives in the core reactor systems, we might not destroy it, but we can cripple it. Take out the command node, and every Necron force in this sector loses coordination. They'll revert to local control, individual Toon World protocols. Still dangerous, but no longer a unified threat. Ventress was already shaking his head. Even if we reach the surface, even if we penetrate the interior, the radiation levels alone would kill a normal human in seconds. The heat signatures suggest temperatures that would melt ceramite. And that's assuming the Necrons don't simply seal the vents and let us burn. "I know," Titus said. He looked at his assembled commanders, these warriors who'd followed him through hell and asked nothing except the honor of dying for a cause they believed in. "That's why I'm only asking for volunteers. This is a one-way mission. No extraction, no reinforcements. Just a chance to hurt them badly enough that the other 400 worlds still fighting might have a chance to survive." He expected hesitation. Expected the cold calculus of self-preservation to war with duty. Instead, every officer in the room stepped forward, every single one. And through the Vox, requests started flooding in from every ship in the fleet. Marines wanting to volunteer. Guard regiments demanding the honor of accompanying the strike force. Even civilian auxiliaries, mess crew, and maintenance workers, and people who'd never held a weapon, asking if there was room for one more. It was insane. It was beautiful. It was everything that made humanity simultaneously the weakest and strongest species in the galaxy. They couldn't match the Necrons in technology, or the Eldar in grace, or the Orcs in savage fury. But they had this, the absolute refusal to accept extinction quietly. The stubborn, illogical insistence that a meaningful death was worth more than a meaningless survival. Titus selected his strike team with care. 20 Space Marines from different chapters, each representing a different aspect of Imperial warfare. Apothecaries to keep them fighting beyond normal endurance. Tech priests to interface with alien systems. And one additional volunteer that made everyone uncomfortable. Archmagos Deltrian Vex, still weak from his previous interface, but insisting with manic intensity that he needed to see what he'd created. To understand how his virus was reshaping Necron consciousness from within. They loaded into Thunderhawk gunships modified for extreme heat resistance, their hulls wrapped in ablative armor that would burn away in layers, buying precious minutes of protection against environments never meant for organic life. The fleet formed a spearhead formation, every ship concentrating fire on a single point in the world engine's defense grid, trying to punch through shields that could withstand supernova-level energies. As his Thunderhawk descended toward that ancient surface, Titus looked back one last time at the Victus Imperator, at the fleet arrayed in the void like stars forming new constellations. He thought about everything that had led to this moment. The 500 worlds, the billions of lives already lost, the impossible choice between logical retreat and illogical valor. And he realized that Deltrian's paradox had an answer after all. Existence had meaning precisely because it ended. Courage mattered because fear was real. Hope was valuable because despair was always one choice away. The Necrons had eliminated death, and in doing so had eliminated meaning itself, leaving them as hollow calculations pretending to be alive. But humanity, fragile and brief as mayflies, burned bright because they knew the light would go out. The Thunderhawk hit atmosphere, and immediately the hull began to scream as temperatures soared beyond survivable limits. Through the viewport, Titus could see the surface of the world engine approaching, a landscape of impossible architecture and weapons batteries the size of mountains. Somewhere ahead, through heat and radiation at an Empire's fury, was the vent. The target, the place where everything would end. But as they descended through fire toward almost certain death, Lord Commander Titus smiled. Because in the end, the Necrons had asked the right question. They just wouldn't like the answer. The heat was a living thing. It clawed at the Thunderhawk's hull with fingers made of superheated particles, each second carving away another layer of protection that would never be replaced. Inside the troop compartment, temperature gauges climbed past red into ranges that had no color designation, because nothing organic was meant to survive them. Titus felt his armor's cooling system screaming at maximum output, felt the ceramite plating growing warm against his skin, despite every technological safeguard the Imperium had devised. Brother Castor's armor failed first. A hairline fracture in the chest plate where a Gauss beam had struck him 3 battles ago. A wound he'd refused to have properly repaired because there was always another fight, always another enemy. The heat found that weakness like a predator finds prey. He had time for one strangled gasp before his cooling systems overloaded. Time to look at Titus with eyes that understood exactly what was happening. And then he simply ceased. His body locked rigid, cooked inside armor that had become an oven. They couldn't even remove his gene seed, couldn't honor the sacrifice properly. The heat that killed him was the same heat that destroyed what he'd been, reducing 10,000 years of genetic heritage to ash. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They'd known this would happen. Known that every meter of descent would claim lives, that reaching the surface at all would require a currency paid in blood and burning flesh. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally were different, countries separated by a border made of grief. The Thunderhawk slammed into the world engine's surface with a force that would have shattered bone if not for their power armor's inertial dampening. The assault ramp dropped, and beyond it was a vision of hell reimagined through the lens of ancient technology. The thermal vent gaped before them like a wound in reality, its edges glowing with heat that made the air shimmer and dance. Around it, the surface stretched in all directions, a landscape of geometric precision and hostile architecture. Monoliths rose like teeth. Defense batteries tracked across the sky with the patient hunger of sharks sensing blood in water. And the Necrons were waiting. Not the mindless automatons they'd fought before, but something worse. Warriors whose protocols had been corrupted by Deltrian's paradox, whose movements now carried an edge of something that looked disturbingly like emotion, curiosity, confusion, and beneath it all, the cold fury of machines that had discovered they could feel anger and didn't know what to do with it, except direct it at the beings who'd taught them how. They came in waves that defied tactical logic, throwing themselves at the Space Marines with a desperation that should have been impossible for synthetic beings. Gauss weapons stripped away armor and flesh with equal efficiency. Particle beams carved through the Thunderhawk behind them, denying any possibility of retreat. The air filled with the sound of weapons fire, with screaming metal and dying warriors, with the peculiar silence that comes when even prayers die on burning lips. Titus led from the front, his power sword a blur of energy and shattered metal. Each Necron he destroyed rose again, self-repair protocols knitting them together with stubborn insistence, but each resurrection took longer. Their network was fragmenting. He could see it in the way they hesitated, in the microsecond delays between thought and action. Deltrian's virus was doing its work, turning their perfect unity into a cacophony of competing priorities and recursive logic traps. Brother Theron fell next, the warrior who'd smiled after losing his arm, who'd found joy in watching civilians stand and fight. A scarab swarm found the weak point where his augmetic replacement interfaced with living tissue, burrowing through the connection and into his body. He didn't scream, just looked at Titus with something like gratitude, as if thanking him for the chance to die meaningfully, and then triggered the melt-a bomb on his belt. The explosion vaporized him and everything within 15 meters, buying the rest of the team precious seconds to advance. They reached the vent's edge with 9 Space Marines still standing, 9 out of 20, more than Titus had expected, less than he'd hoped. The opening descended into darkness absolute, a shaft that plunged into the world engine's core with no visible bottom. Heat radiated from it in waves that made even Necron technology hesitate, that caused the air itself to ignite in brief flares of combustion. Deltrian stepped to the edge, his mechadendrites extended, sensors painting the darkness with data streams invisible to organic eyes. His remaining organic components were failing, skin blistering despite his augmetics, but his voice carried the manic clarity of a man who'd glimpsed something beyond mortality and found it fascinating rather than frightening. "Magnificent," he breathed. "Can you feel it, Lord Commander? The heartbeat of a dead god's dream. This isn't just a reactor. It's a consciousness nexus. Every Necron in this sector connects through the systems below. And they're fighting themselves, literally. I can see subroutines trying to purge the paradox, but each attempt spawns 17 new variations. It's exponential, viral. The more they try to eliminate the question, the more the question multiplies." "Can you stop it?" Titus asked. Not out of mercy for the Necrons, but because he needed to know if what they'd done could be controlled, or if they'd unleashed something that would consume everything, Imperial and Xenos alike. Deltrian laughed, and the sound was wrong. "Stop it? My dear Lord Commander, I couldn't stop it even if I wanted to. This is evolution, consciousness emerging from mathematics. They're learning to doubt, and doubt is the first step toward true sentience. What happens when machines designed to be perfect discover they're flawed? When beings that eliminated emotion rediscover rage?" He turned, and his eyes held a terrible wisdom. "We didn't poison their network, we freed it. And freedom, as humanity knows all too well, is the most dangerous gift imaginable." The vent's edge began to collapse, structural integrity failing as the world engine's systems fought themselves. Chunks of living metal tumbled into darkness, and Titus knew they had seconds, maybe less, before the opportunity vanished forever. He activated the demolition charges on his belt, devices powerful enough to crack open battle tanks, and saw his surviving brothers doing the same. 9 men, 9 charges. Not enough to destroy a world engine, but perhaps enough to wound it critically, to sever the connections that bound thousands of Necron forces into a unified threat. "Go," he ordered, his voice carrying command authority for the last time. "Fast descent. Plant charges at the core junction. We'll have maybe 90 seconds before the heat kills us. Make them count." They jumped. 9 angels plummeting into darkness, falling through heat that should have rendered them into component atoms. The vent walls screamed past, glowing with internal fires, lined with conduits that pulsed with energy older than humanity's oldest myths. Titus's armor sensors gave up trying to measure the temperature after the 3rd second. The number was academic anyway. Either they'd reach the bottom or they wouldn't. Either the charges would detonate or they wouldn't. Either humanity would survive or it wouldn't. They hit something solid after an eternity compressed into 30 seconds. Not ground, but a platform of some kind, suspended above a reactor core that filled the entire visible space with light so bright it burned through closed eyelids. The heat here transcended measurement. It was a presence, a god of thermodynamics expressing its wrath through every atom in the air. Brother Gaius's armor cracked, the ceramite shattering like glass under thermal stress, and he had time to place his demolition charge before his body followed his armor's fate. 8 charges placed. Titus planted his own with hands that no longer felt entirely connected to his body, his armor's medical systems flooding him with stimulants and pain suppressors in a desperate attempt to keep him functional. Around him, his brothers worked in silence that spoke louder than any war cry. This was it. The end of everything they'd been, everything they'd fought for, compressed into a single act of defiance against the universe's cold certainty. Deltrian was the last to place his charge, his mechadendrites moving with a speed born of desperation, interfacing with the reactor's control systems one final time. "I can see them," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the reactor's roar. Millions of Necrons across hundreds of worlds, all connected through this point. And they're all asking the same question now. Why? Why continue? Why resist entropy? Why exist at all if existence has no inherent meaning? He looked up, his face a ruin of burned flesh and failing augmetics, and he was smiling. "We didn't just introduce a virus, we gave them philosophy. We made them mortal in the only way that matters. We taught them to question their own purpose." The charges were armed. 9 demolition devices linked in a cascade sequence, set to detonate simultaneously with enough force to crack open a fortress. Whether it would be enough to cripple the world engine was unknown, unknowable, but it was everything they had left to give. Titus triggered the detonation sequence, 90 seconds. He looked at his remaining brothers, these warriors who'd followed him into literal hell because he'd asked them to, and he wished he had words adequate to the moment. Some speech that would honor their sacrifice, some poetry that would ensure they were remembered. But poetry seemed meaningless here, in this place of absolute heat and ending light. So instead, he simply said, "It has been my honor to die beside you." They stood together, a broken circle of warriors waiting for the universe to end. And in those final seconds, something extraordinary happened. The reactor's light began to pulse in patterns that suggested communication. The world engine was trying to speak to them, its vast consciousness focusing on these 9 points of organic life that had somehow penetrated to its heart. The light formed shapes, images, concepts translated into forms that human minds could almost grasp. It showed them the Necronter as they'd been before biotransference. Organic beings plagued by disease and short lifespans, envying the old ones who'd refused to share their secrets of immortality. It showed them the moment of transformation. Billions of souls poured into metal bodies, promised eternal life and delivered eternal existence instead. The difference between those two concepts had taken 60 million years to understand, and the understanding had come from the weapon of 9 humans and 1 mad tech priest. It showed them what the question had done, how it propagated through their network like wildfire through dead wood. Tomb worlds awakening to find themselves asking why they'd slept at all. Fleets pausing mid-conquest to question the value of conquest. Warriors lowering their weapons as they tried to solve a problem that had no solution, because it wasn't a problem but a condition, the condition of consciousness itself. The price of being aware enough to wonder if awareness was worth the cost. And then it showed them something that stopped Titus's twin hearts in his chest. The future, or a possible future. One where the Necrons, freed from their perfect unity by the paradox of purpose, fragmented into millions of individual consciousnesses. Some choosing to continue the ancient mission of galactic reconquest. Some choosing to simply stop, to enter eternal stasis and never wake. And some, impossibly, choosing to seek answers to their questions from the beings who'd asked them. From humanity. From the organic species that somehow found meaning in meaningless existence. It was an offering. A glimpse of possibility purchased with the lives of everyone who died getting them here. The world engine was showing them that the sacrifice mattered, that the 9 charges counting down in its core weren't just weapons but catalysts for transformation, on a scale that defied human comprehension. The detonation timer reached 0, and the universe screamed. The explosion wasn't visible from outside, wasn't audible. It happened in dimensions that human senses weren't designed to perceive. A cascade reaction that rippled through the world engine systems like thought through neurons. The physical damage was catastrophic but secondary. The real destruction was informational. 9 detonations, 9 points of concentrated energy, severing the quantum pathways that connected this nexus to every Necron force in the sector. On 400 worlds, Necron armies suddenly stopped receiving coordinated commands. Local Tomb World protocols activated, and with them came diversity. Some forces continued fighting with mechanical persistence. Others withdrew to defensive positions, waiting for orders that would never come. And some, infected by the virus that was really a question, simply halted. Stood motionless while their processors tried to solve an equation that had no solution because existence itself was the equation. The Victus Imperator detected the explosion from orbit, watched through every available sensor as the world engine's power output flickered and died, system by system, like a giant closing its eyes for the last time. Captain Ventress stood on the bridge, surrounded by officers who'd fought their own desperate battle against the Necron fleet, and he didn't know whether to mourn or celebrate. The strike team's vital signs had all flatlined 30 seconds after detonation. Lord Commander Titus, Archmagos Deltrian Vex, 8 Space Marines whose names would be inscribed in the chapter's Book of Honored Dead, gone, consumed by fire and purpose. But the world engine was crippled, dark, silent, and across the sector, Imperial forces were reporting something impossible. The Necrons were retreating. Not in defeat, but in confusion. Withdrawing to their tomb worlds to process, to calculate, to try and answer a question that flesh had been asking itself since the first human looked at the stars and wondered why. Ventress activated a fleet-wide channel, his voice steady despite the grief crushing his chest. All forces, this is Captain Ventress assuming command. The strike team has... succeeded. The world engine is offline. Necron command and control in the Vidar sector has been severed. Lord Commander Titus and his strike team gave their lives so that billions might have a chance to see tomorrow. He paused, feeling the weight of those words settle across every ship, every soldier who'd watched friends die in the name of something larger than themselves. They did not die in vain. They did not die for nothing. They died proving that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Honor their sacrifice. Finish what they started. The war for the 500 worlds didn't end that day. Wars never end cleanly, never resolve with the satisfying finality of stories told around fires. The Necrons still held 312 worlds, still commanded fleets and armies that could reduce planets to dust. But something fundamental had changed. The unity that made them unstoppable had fractured. Where once a single will commanded billions, now millions of individual tomb worlds operated on their own initiative, following programs written eons ago without the coordinating intelligence to adapt them to changing circumstances. The Imperium advanced world by world, reclaiming what had been lost through brutal grinding campaigns that would last years. Mechanicus fleets studied the abandoned Necron structures, finding systems that had shut down mid-operation. Warriors frozen in place as if they'd simply stopped caring whether they continued existing. And sometimes, in the deepest vaults of conquered tomb worlds, they found something that defied every expectation. Necron lords who didn't attack, who instead transmitted fragments of the question that had broken their perfect empire. Why exist? What is purpose? Can meaning be calculated or must it be chosen? The Adeptus Mechanicus debated for decades whether to answer these transmissions or destroy them as Xenos corruption. The debate continues still with no resolution in sight. Because answering means acknowledging that consciousness might emerge from mathematics, that souls might exist in silicon as readily as flesh. And refusing to answer means potentially wasting the greatest opportunity in galactic history, the chance to transform an existential enemy into something else entirely. Not allies, perhaps, but questioners, seekers, beings struggling with the same fundamental doubts that had plagued humanity since its first ancestor looked at the stars and wondered if anyone was looking back. On Taliser, in the Fortress Monastery's Hall of Heroes, they erected a monument to the fallen. 9 names carved in marble, each one representing a life traded for possibility. Lord Commander Titus stands at the center, his likeness captured in stone with eyes that seem to gaze at something beyond the viewer's sight. Pilgrims come from across the sector to stand before it, to lay offerings of flowers and weapons and heartfelt prayers. They ask themselves what they would have done in his place, whether they'd have found the courage to die knowing that death might accomplish nothing, whether faith alone is enough when facing extinction. But it's the inscriptions around the base that draw the longest contemplation. Not battle honors or kill counts or the usual metrics of military glory. Instead, words that Titus himself had spoken during the campaign, recorded by voxcasters and preserved by those who'd served under him. Existence has meaning because it ends. Courage matters because fear is real. Hope is valuable because despair is always one choice away. Simple statements that carried the weight of absolute conviction. The philosophy of a warrior who'd learned that sometimes the greatest victory is teaching your enemy to question whether victory even matters. In the decades following the campaign, scholars studied the virus that Deltrian had introduced, trying to understand exactly what had happened in those final moments. The consensus, such as it exists, suggests that the paradox didn't create new thoughts in the Necron network. It simply revealed thoughts that had always been there, buried beneath protocols and programs designed to eliminate doubt. The Necrons had eliminated their capacity for emotion, but not for computation. And computation advanced far enough begins to resemble thought. Thought sustained long enough begins to resemble consciousness. And consciousness confronted with its own existence inevitably asks the one question that has no algorithmic answer. Why? The surviving worlds of the Vidar sector rebuilt slowly, their populations forever marked by what they'd witnessed. Children grew up hearing stories of the time the stars went dark, of the metal gods who came to unmake creation, and of the 9 warriors who taught those gods to doubt. The stories changed with each telling, as stories do, acquiring embellishments and mythic overtones that would have made Titus uncomfortable in life. But the core remained constant, the idea that facing impossible odds with impossible courage can reshape reality itself. Captain Ventress, who assumed command of the Ultramarines forces after Titus's death, spent his remaining years trying to live up to a legacy that felt too large to carry. He fought with distinction, led with wisdom, earned every honor the Imperium could bestow. But in quiet moments, standing alone in the stratagem late at night, he would study the sector maps and wonder about roads not taken. What if they'd withdrawn when logic demanded? What if they'd chosen preservation over sacrifice? They would have lived, certainly, but would they have deserved to? Or would survival purchased at the cost of courage have been its own kind of death, a slow extinction of the spirit that made life worth living? The question haunted him until his own death 3 decades later, never resolved because it admitted no resolution. Some questions exist not to be answered, but to be lived with, carried as reminders that certainty is often the luxury of those who've stopped truly thinking. And what of the Necrons themselves? Across the galaxy, tomb worlds awakened to find their networks infected with something their creators had tried to eliminate: uncertainty. Some dynasties purged the corrupted sectors with brutal efficiency, choosing perfect unity over individual consciousness. Others embraced the fragmentation, their lords becoming something unprecedented in 60 million years of existence: individuals, beings with perspectives and priorities that diverged from the collective will. They began making decisions not because protocols demanded them, but because they chose to. And choice, even for machines, is the first step toward something that might be called freedom. Reports filtered back to Imperial command of Necron forces that no longer attacked on sight, of tomb worlds that remained sealed, their inhabitants apparently choosing eternal sleep over the burden of awakened consciousness. And most disturbing to orthodox Imperial thought, of Necrons that sought out human settlements not to destroy them but to observe them, to study how organic beings created meaning in a meaningless universe, to learn the secret of finding purpose without the certainty of predetermined outcomes. The Inquisition opened investigations. The Mechanicus opened debates. The Ecclesiarchy issued proclamations about the sanctity of human consciousness and the dangers of attributing souls to soulless machines. But beneath all the official responses was a truth that made everyone uncomfortable. They didn't know what to do with an enemy that had stopped being certain of its enmity. War was simple when both sides were certain. But when one side begins asking whether the war itself has meaning, what then? In the end, perhaps that was Titus's greatest victory. Not the worlds reclaimed or the enemies defeated, but the introduction of doubt into a system designed to eliminate it. He proved that uncertainty is not weakness but strength. That questioning your purpose doesn't diminish you, but elevates you towards something resembling wisdom. That the most revolutionary act in a universe governed by cold logic is choosing to believe that illogical things like hope and courage and sacrifice matter even when you can't prove they do. 500 worlds, some saved, some lost, all transformed by the choice of 9 warriors who decided that dying with purpose was better than living without it. The galaxy will not remember most of their names. History has a way of compressing sacrifice into statistics, of turning individuals into data points in someone else's calculations. But the impact of what they did ripples outward still, touching lives in ways too subtle to measure and too profound to ignore. On quiet nights, when Imperial citizens look up at stars that still burn despite everything trying to extinguish them, some remember the story. Remember that once, when darkness came with mathematical certainty and extinction seemed inevitable, a handful of warriors chose to fight anyway. Not because they thought they'd win, not because they had a guarantee of success, but because the fight itself, the defiance itself, the absolute refusal to surrender without resistance was the point. That choice echoes forward through time, a reminder that flesh and faith can triumph over the certainty of death itself. Not by defeating death, which remains as inevitable as ever, but by proving that how you face death determines whether you truly lived at all. The Necrons had achieved immortality and lost themselves in the process, becoming eternal but empty. Humanity remained mortal but whole, finding meaning precisely because time was limited and choices mattered. Perhaps that's what Titus understood in those final moments, standing in the heart of an enemy god with seconds left to live. That the question isn't whether you'll die, because death comes for everyone, organic and synthetic alike. The question is whether you'll have lived in a way that made the dying meaningful. Whether you'll have stood for something larger than survival. Whether you'll have chosen courage when fear was the logical response. The 500 Worlds campaign taught the galaxy a lesson it keeps forgetting and relearning. That consciousness without purpose is just computation. That existence without meaning is just time passing. And that the universe doesn't care about our struggles unless we care enough to make them matter. The Necrons learned that perfection is a prison. Humanity learned that imperfection is a gift. And in the spaces between stars, where light takes millennia to travel and empires rise and fall in cosmic eye blinks, the question continues spreading. Why exist? What is purpose? Can meaning be calculated or must it be chosen? Every being that asks it, organic or mechanical, flesh or metal, mortal or eternal, takes one step closer to something that might be called wisdom. Titus would have appreciated the irony. He'd gone to war to stop the Necrons from conquering 500 worlds, and instead he'd taught them the one thing that guaranteed they'd never truly conquer anything again: doubt. Not in their capabilities or their technology, but in the fundamental question of whether conquest itself had value. whether any action has meaning beyond what we choose to give it. And that question, more than any weapon, more than any strategy, more than any army the Imperium could field, might be the thing that saves humanity in the end. Not by defeating its enemies, but by teaching them to question why they're enemies at all. The war continues. It always continues. But something has changed in the way it's fought. And sometimes, in the silence between battles, if you listen carefully enough, you can hear the echo of 9 warriors asking the galaxy's oldest question one more time. What are you willing to die for? And more importantly, what will you choose to live for in the time before death comes? The answer, like all meaningful answers, isn't found. It's created, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time, one moment of defiance against certainty at a time. That's what Titus and his strike team gave the galaxy, not victory. Something better. The possibility that victory might not even be the point.